So thank you, thank you, Omri, Dominique, and Adrien. Since someone has to be accountable for the timing, and I care about your lunch and your stomachs, I had tons of questions, but maybe we're gonna focus on a few of them. I think one of the first questions I wanted to ask you, which is a little bit of the elephant in the room, is how can we make the big platforms like the one? I mean, if data is the new oil, and if data is the oil of this economy, we have some people who have squeezed quite a big piece of that data, and those are the GAFAs, the BATs, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent for China. And how can we make them accountable? There's not 1 week without having like some sensational, media coverage. Recent, fine yesterday from Google, it amounts like 8 billion in 2 years for various, chiefs. Many of them see them as new monopolies. And in my old economist, training, I remember that when there's a monopoly, regulation should come in at some point. And on top of it, they are not really incentivized, back to the points that were discussed, they are not really incentivized to take into account the negative externalities of what they are doing. By the way, not even the positive neither. So is competition law and a way to make them accountable? Data privacy regulation, something else? So this is what I wanted to have your mind on.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to the panel in the afternoon, and to my colleague Randy Picker from Chicago and other members of the panel to answer this question, because I think this is one of the most, maybe the hardest question that antitrust law and competition law has faced in a long time. These kind of monopolies are not like the old monopolies. They are doing also a lot of good by virtue of being large. So it is a tough question. I personally don't have the answer.
Anyone else?
I'm not a lawyer, so I couldn't have any kind of good solution for that. But there are two things for platforms and regulation of new kind of computation that they are making that are important for me. The first is that it's the range of data that they use for computation, and we need to control, and they need to be more accountable of the kind of data that they are using, because we know that they are using tracks of behavior of the internet user of their own service, but they are using a lot of more different data sets, and we need to have a very strong regulation on this question. And the other thing that I have in mind is the fact that we have a new adaptive circulation feedback loop of the definition of the outcome, the objective of the algorithm, and we need to have a new design of the interface of those services, letting the user define for himself what is the objective that he wants to fulfill, and that's something that they're beginning to do, but we are very, very far from the ideal solution for that.
And the second question was about algorithms. So I think because in ethics and accountability for data economy, there are really, for me, two different sets of things. The first is ethics and accountability in terms of data collection, which is a big theme that you all touched about. And the second thing is data and accountability of algorithms, because the data really fuels analytics at scale, and then algorithms that are really taking decisions that impact us like every day in terms of product recommendation, being targeted. When I was listening to you, Dominique, I felt, it was fascinating. I think you could take the lead of my precision advertising team, in L'Oréal, because what you describe is exactly what we do every day. So how can we deal with accountability for algorithms? Can we, and the sub-question would be, can we ask an algorithm to be neutral? Because I think that's a key thing.
Thank you for the question, because it recalled me that there's something I wanted to add and I forgot during the talk. I said that data protection law should work with anti-discrimination statutes, and I may have a suggestion for that. So in the GDPR, you have for certain processing that have a high risk for the individual liberties, the need to realize a data protection impact assessment. And in the book last year that I wrote, I suggested that maybe in that DPIA we should integrate some discrimination impact assessment. I think this is something that could be really easily implemented, and maybe in some if some European Data Protection Board or other actors wrote opinions around that, I think that would be really useful for users to maybe have access to some of the logic behind the algorithm functioning without revealing some, trade secrets or like important information about the business models. And it's a way to make algorithm a bit more accountable, I guess.
When I read your research, Dominique, I read something where you wanted to go from neutrality to loyalty. Is it something you want to say a few words about? Because I found that really interesting.
Yeah, the idea is that I think it's not a good idea to ask an algorithm to be neutral. That's not their function. They need to rank information. They have some principle, and they will rank information regarding one or another principle. So we have to discuss what is the principle that that have been implemented in the calculation, and that's the reason why some lawyers, as James Grimmelman, for example, ask for loyalty of algorithm, because they need to do what the user thinks that the algorithm is saying to do. So we need to have this kind of adjustment between the representation, and it's a very vague and with a lot of misunderstanding, the representation of users on the algorithm. And I also want to underline the fact that there are very, very different kind of algorithms. So we can have an accountability of the predictors with dataset training system and outcomes with static data on symbolic labels, but with deep learning techniques, we don't have labels, it's subsymbolic. So the accountability should put a focus on the outcomes, because it's always symbolic in this way.
I think that one of the lessons that I took from the morning keynote by Sendil Mullinatham was that we should be careful in accusing algorithms of doing things that we, as human decision makers operating without algorithms, of course don't do, because we are all fair and non-discriminatory and aware of what we're doing. I think that the lesson that we that he did from his talk has to be summarized is that it's probably the other way around. But nevertheless, there are new forms of visible discrimination that we didn't notice before and now occur in the algorithmic world. So, for example, if Google search, when you search a name, if it's a black-sounding name, the first results, the results of previous arrest records is more likely to come up than a white name in the US. Or if Facebook, you see that advertisements on Facebook, advertisements on careers in technology are given to men more than to women. These are forms of very uncomfortable discrimination, and I think that they have to be uprooted. But I would say two things. One, are we sure that they did not exist in the world of pre-algorithm, that women career consultants in colleges or in high schools did not direct they did not direct women to different careers? I'm skeptical about that assumption. And secondly, isn't it encouraging that we can identify these things precisely? It's no longer an assumption. Now we know what these things happen, and it is a very important type of knowledge in order to be able to define some constraints on how algorithms are used.
Well, I think this is a very important point. I think one of the things to do is really to ask for those big groups to make public, in a way, the way they are taking decisions. The criteria that they are using, maybe not at a very precise level, but at least at a broad level, so that we can at least have a reverse accountability. Meaning, when I feel I have been, discriminated, I can ask. Then I should have a channel to ask back in terms of those were the criteria. This is where I fear I was maybe discriminated against. So I think that's one big thing. But what struck me in everything you said was the trade-offs. It's full of trade-offs, in fact. It's full of trade-offs, the risk and the benefit, as you said, because there are negative externalities and harms, as you said, but there are also many positive externalities. Think health. I mean, health is the most obvious one. Protecting privacy, but also building tech competitive advantage. I think China has less seminars around ethics and accountability on data, and they are building a massive competitive advantage in terms of AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the breadth and depth of data that is managed at that stage, obviously by private companies like Alibaba and Tencent. It's just huge. It defies the intelligence, transparency. But one of the big debate around GDPR was also the confusion. Sometimes the complicated consumer experience that comes with it when you have to go back and log and again, accept and stuff like that. But also making, exactly as I said, criteria for algorithm open and public. But how does that compare, exactly as you said, with the IP, the trade secret, and the whole business model that those platforms are building upon? And then what strikes me also is that private companies are incentivized to see the positive effect of data and of AI. To be honest, it's your consumer better. You can have formidable efficiencies using those techniques. And then governments and data officers are sometimes very very biased or geared to see only the negative effects. So my question is who should step in? How should we organize that whole debate? Who should be leading that debate? Because it's a debate that goes beyond private companies, that go beyond, I think, data regulators. How should we and who should step in?
Well, I'll say, I think that we use sometimes terms like solutions, like transparency, accountability, in a way that I find relatively superfluous. Namely, I'm not sure exactly what good does it do. It, of course, doesn't do any harm to have more transparency. So let's, use these kind of solutions. And I think in the history of consumer protection, which is my main area of expertise, the idea of transparency has defeated every other regulatory solution. Just make firms shine the light. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. It is, I think I called it superfluous because it doesn't really address any of the problems, and it doesn't make any difference in the world in which to the problems we're trying to solve. And I'm a little bit worried that the notion of accountability, let's make firms more accountable, is going to run into the same trap of being overly inclusive and a little bit, it doesn't have exact teeth. Once we want to have regulation with teeth that tell actors what they are not allowed to do, or even worse, what they must do, intervene in their decisions in this way, I think it has to be done only with a very accurate, more precise and accurate identification and diagnosis of what is the harm that is being caused. When we see particular forms of harm, we can try to identify narrow solutions, targeted solutions, sometimes broad solutions, but we cannot fall back, I think, on general formulas to answer your question.
And if we consider and it's my last question, then we open, if you want, to the public. If we consider that as in a way a societal infrastructure, let's put it that way, does it make sense to imagine a public utility service for data, like un service public de la donnée?
In healthcare, it's a big question, especially for, let's say, for example, in research, if you have open data policy, you might want to share, I don't know, data about metagenomics or a patient that are being treated for cancer, because you want to share that with other database and have better insights. And at the same time, how do you, incentivize people from making the financial investment in the first place? So it has a lot of difficult questions, and back also to privacy, since you can re-identify someone. I mean, back to data protection.
Just a word, because we had a very good example this morning with the keynote speaker. We also need to have a new cooperation between computer scientists and regulation authorities, and we see that this kind of information, the issue are so technical that we need to produce counterfactuals. We need to calculate the data, and this new collaboration is mandatory.
And education. And education, because
too,
I think general education and awareness around those topics is not great. I mean, great general public for sure, but even for the decision makers sometimes. You want to open the questions to the room?
Thank you. Hi, my question is for Dominique Cardon. I think that in your presentation, the main topic was about manipulation of the users concerning goods and services consumed. But next step, my question would be, what about protection against manipulation of the users concerning implementation of ideas or belief in our brains?
That's a big one.
I'm not sure that I will support the idea of global manipulation of individuals. I really think, but it's also part of my work that we have more. We are more autonomous, that we sometimes think in the new individual conception of the idea that information could change our mind or attitude or opinion. For example, in the debate about fake news, I'm really not sure. I'm sure that we have a lot of fake news circulating everywhere, but I'm not sure that they have any kind of effect on individuals. I'm sure we overestimate the idea that they have a strong effect on people. So I don't know how I could follow on your answer on this question.
There has recently been a proposal of law for the French programming of justice for 2018 to 2022, and one of these within this proposal there is the proposal to restrict the access to the data generated by courts on the grounds of protection of personal data of judges and other just Court of Justice employee. So I was wondering, how seriously do you think needs to be taken the concern of a sort of collision between the imperative of personal data protection and opening data for research purposes and innovation and bettering society as a whole? That seems to be quite a huge conflict, in my opinion. I was wondering if you had any perceptions on the matter.
I don't know much about this, but it sounds to me like an abuse of the notion of privacy. The judges have something to hide about the decision that they reach and should not be studied in a rigorous way to identify patterns. Is that what privacy is about? Not to expose or maybe I don't understand exactly what is being hidden, but I think that there is, look, court decisions are becoming publicly available in data in digital form for studies and have revolutionized our understanding of what's going on in courts. Judicial decision-making, judicial behavior in general is now understood, I think, much better. And a lot of myths that we had about judges and how they work differently than other occupations. Judges are workers. They go, they have a job to do. And there are many ways to measure what they do that can be done with data. Now, it has to be good data. It has to be representative data, not manipulable. The studies have to be peer-reviewed and replicated, and all of that today. But I think that the question of whether to make the data available seems to me a non-starter.
Hi. In many of the topics you talked about, there's a notion of representability that comes into play. So if you talk about trying to make algorithm neutral, or enforcing equality or evaluating harm on population comes in a notion of who's represented, who's being ensured to be equal to whom. How do you think we should approach this in a quite practical way?
I think the question came up in the after Ariel Porat's study, a discussion of personalization, and I think that one other thing to say. I think Ariel said it very eloquently, is that treating people fairly does not mean one size fits all. It would be really silly to force us all to wear the same size shoes on the grounds of fairness. We think that sometimes to tailor different clothes, shoes, and even rules might make sense. The question is always, what is the underlying conception that we use to differentiate the treatment? It was, Marx that says, to each according to needs, right? So identifying that people should be treated differently. If the debate has to be about what is the underlying conception that differentiates us, how rich it should be, whether it should be, some differences should be ignored or not, but it cannot be that we all have to be treated the same in a one size fits all. So I'm not sure that's what you asked, but.
This is sorry. I'm not a specialist at all, but let me jump in. So I think this is where the data minimization concept is complicated, because I think that when you try to limit the amount, which can be understandable in the context of pollution, when you try to limit the amount of data that goes in, you create tons of biases, in fact, because some people will not want to give their data. Maybe those people will have very specific characteristics, and the underlying panel will be super biased, which was not the case when we used to do sociological studies, etc. We used to be very attentive to the fact that it was representative, etc. So I think the quality of the underlying data, and in fact, quite paradoxically in a way, the fact that we have broad assets and broad amounts of data that are collected can make algorithm better and fairer. But that's just my view.
But it shows that we need more data to have more specification of the features that could personalize the recommendation for a user. All the new algorithmic adaptive systems that I've described have the idea of personalization of recommendation for each user in mind. So the idea is clearly to differentiate people, and I really think that it's a kind of global expectation of a society. So I think it in a certain way, it's a good thing for music recommendation. We don't have the same taste. We don't want to hear the same piece of music. So if the tracks of my music listening could help to have my favorite music on the border of my traditional taste in order to discover things that are at the periphery of my own taste, it could be a good thing. But it could also create, with this idea of personalization, the disappearance of the idea that we belong to the same category and we are equal because of the equivalence between categories could create problems in the way it could reproduce inequality in our society, because it's my behavior that define the objectives that will be used for the recommendation system. And if I have a lot of friends, if I travel a lot, if I have a lot of activities, I have a lot of things to publish, and the algorithm will suggest me very diverse and open information in order to reinforce my own diversity. But if I don't have a lot of friends, I don't travel a lot, I don't publish, I publish only on one subject, it could create a kind of filter bubble and a loop in which I could be trapped in the system. And we don't have nothing to say because it's the responsibility of user. You don't have diverse traces of behavior to give to the algorithm, so you won't have a lot of choice in the recommendation that the algorithm will offer to you.
Hello, and thank you for very interesting observations. My question is more related to productive justice, and it came out when you were referring to the discriminative nature of human beings. So I was actually wondering, and I don't know whether it comes from the fact that I might not fully understand the technical aspects of the algorithms. So if we come as an input all the algorithms and the judges being human beings may make the discriminative calls and decisions. So if that's the input, then we go to the conclusion that the case law, it has the discrimination factor in it. So how can we use the algorithms to actually eliminate this discrimination? That's the first question. And then the second one is actually, we know that law evolves with the time. And if we go to the productive justice and we base the case, like the decisions to be rendered on the case law, how do we make the case law evolve? I might be missing some elements. Thank you.
Well, I think we had the striking example again in the morning when Sendil showed us the bail study and said that the predictions that the algorithm that they trained make about who to give release on bail and who to not, the algorithm, like the judges, was discriminatory. It was going to release more white people than black people. But then it was just changing one line of code, saying you are under the constraint, you are the algorithm, you are under the constraint to release, to provide predictions in which you, whatever predictions you make, it has to be the same rate for blacks and whites. Try to do that for human. Now it's so I think that there are ways to do it once the patterns are identified. The patterns are, relating to my comment before, the patterns are easier to identify once you have use an algorithm to make predictions that will then influence the decisions. And that are also, once we identify them, are easier to correct, at least at the prediction level.
So thank you very much. Thanks for the questions and have a great lunch.